Right, this next point is about land use credits. If I could just hand over to my colleague to explain what land use credits are.
I've written a little definition here that's short and simple. A land use credit is where new off-site provision of, for example, housing, affordable housing, or possibly even social and community use is provided in advance by a developer on the basis that it will satisfy policy requirements of future commercial developments. The planning obligation agreement would then link the commercial scheme to the appropriate credit. So you provide a facility in excess of what would be required, and you provide that in advance of your commercial development.
Are there any concerns that anybody would have about the land use credit system, about how that might operate, or whether or not it's a good idea?
At the risk of talking too much, the key thing is to have a term on it, to make sure that it's termed. My feeling is that it should be 5 years. 3 is too short, and 8 to 10 probably is too long, because it gets you into the problem of how you compare values. However, if you take my idea and you don't do it on a value basis, but you do it on a floor plate basis, you don't have that problem. So that's one of the attractions of doing this on a floor plate basis. But I think it should be termed.
So you wouldn't do it by value at all? You'd simply, it would be the proportion of the floor space, and you provide it at any particular time?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And is there any particular reason why why it's particularly important, excuse me, to have it term constrained?
Again, I think the more certainty you can give people and the more structure you can give to it, the better.
Okay, thank you. There's people.
Yes, just to say that I'm aware that the Planning Brief Subcommittee considered this issue last week, and having just read the minutes, I understand that there are some concerns on the part of members of the committee, and I do understand the need for simplicity and avoiding complexity. I think one of the significant benefits of a residential land use credit system is simply that the housing would come forward far sooner than would otherwise be the case in the absence of such a system.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other advantages anybody would raise, or any criteria that should be applied to the land use credits if we brought it in as a policy option?
A couple of thoughts. First of all, just to echo Keith's comments, this whole idea was about trying to create the incentive to make residential development happen faster, and it's worth just restating that. In a world where if you don't do it, you delay residential because you will wait till you can do a swap or some other solution. So that's the context of this. I think it is important to keep it straightforward, and a land use floor area basis is the best way, I think, probably to do it. As to the term, I think it depends on the type of the credit. If the credit is essentially broadly open market, so open market housing, then a more restricted term is appropriate. But if, as many of you know, you produce an affordable housing credit, if you imagine what that means in practice, taking an open market value development and of your choice, slashing the capital value of that site to something that is deliberately worth far less in order that you can use it later. I think in those circumstances, an affordable housing credit would probably have to have a longer term, because you're deliberately writing off value over a considerable period, and you wouldn't do that unless you've covered your risk of trying to recover that value later. So I think the term depends on the type of the credit.
Okay, thank you. That's quite an important distinction between a credit for housing and a credit for affordable housing. Thank you.
Hugh Morgan, DP9. I'm not sure you actually need a term on it, because in effect you're providing the goodies up front. And so if you do that and you're providing what the council wants, then it doesn't necessarily matter when that then gets cashed in effect. And having too short or restrictive a time period on it may well affect bringing forward the residential affordable in the first place.
Okay. Could I just go back to Hugh's point, just differentiating between the housing and the affordable housing? What would your view be on the term? Obviously, a lot of these schemes will have both, because if it's acceptable to have housing on the site, then it should also be acceptable in most cases to have the affordable housing. So you would expect the credit site, if you like, to have both types or a mix of tenures on them?
In practice, that tends not to happen, and the reason is that the vast majority of development in Westminster is at the margin because it's a fully developed city with conservation area constraints. So by and large, buildings change by relatively small amounts, and it's because of that, of these small net changes to which you apply mixed-use policy, that is part of the problem when you try and resolve it on a site-by-site basis. You actually need a very large scheme to add so much floor space that it creates so much housing that you then get over the affordable housing threshold. So in practice, it's actually quite rare. And I think if you were to do the research, and certainly our experience is most of these are relatively small changes.
And I guess that's another question in terms of the land use credits. I mean, because there would be a lot of control over how it's being provided, would there be an incentive or an ability to make quite sure that the donor sites always fall below the affordable housing threshold, because they would be donor sites that aren't otherwise coming forward?
I think it would be perfectly sensible to appraise the site on the basis of what it would have yielded under normal circumstances, and then to work off the net increase in affordable housing through this policy. Yeah, I think that would be perfectly sensible thing to do and perfectly possible. Just going back to what the benefits are, just to emphasise this point, land values in Westminster have gyrated, by extraordinary margins in the last 3 years. If there was a structured approach to this and one which gave some certainty to both sides, one could have benefited from that. And it really, really makes a big difference. I mean, we're looking today at sites which were worth £12 million only 2 years ago, which we're buying today at £6 million. Now, that gives you an awful lot more affordable housing, and it's worth taking that into account when you look at the benefits of the system.
Okay.
Members have been very concerned about trading in credits and that whole notion. But just listening to this debate and what you've been saying, Mark, and things, I just wonder whether, particularly at the moment, if we were to allow that and to develop a policy which allowed that, would that catalyse now far more housing development throughout the city? Would people be banking those sites? Would that bring to fruition our ambitions far quicker?
Absolutely. There's no doubt. I mean, it's tough to find good infill sites in Westminster, but they're there, and if you had that certainty, you would definitely want to go out and buy those sites. And I think you would be able to upfront affordable housing in a very, very meaningful way. So, yes, if it was a traded market, I think that would encourage it even further.
I guess just thinking further along that, I mean, there may need to be two types of land use credit at the very least. One would be where you provide purely housing, and the other where you provide the appropriate mix of housing and affordable housing, and that if you had a site that generated a requirement for housing, that could only be taken from a land use credit that had been provided on a purely housing site. And similarly, if you do generate an affordable housing requirement, that could only be held against a credit that included an element of affordable housing, because there is quite a distinction between things below the threshold and above the threshold, and we would need to be very sure that we weren't losing the affordable housing element through this process. Is there any support for that? Consideration or further comment on that issue?